This video will tell you everything you need to know about the 2013 YCS Miami format. Time Wizard formats are blossoming into larger scale competitions. Assuming you pay attention to retro Yu-Gi-Oh, you've probably heard of at least one of the formats on the screen here. But I'm not going to talk about any of these formats. Today I want to break down a format for some reason no one knows about. That format is 2013 YCS Miami. The format is called 2013 YCS Miami because I couldn't think of a better name. And unfortunately, there are multiple YCS Miamis that have occurred, so the 2013 is necessary. That being said, YCS Miami is my second favorite format only to Tengu Clan, and I'm really excited to finally share it with you all. So let's first dive in and find out what exactly is YCS Miami format. YCS Miami 2013 was an event that took place on February 18th, 2013. This format takes place on the September 2012 ban list and is the very last event before the ban list changed. The last legal set is Cosmo Blazer as well as the Fire King structure deck. This is perfectly timed before the release of many powerful cards from both Hidden Arsenal 7 and Tachyon Galaxy. I like to think of this as the nerfed era of Yu-Gi-Oh! We had just come off a very die roll and sacky format consisting of the wind-up loop, full power Dino Rabbit, Inzectors, and Chaos Dragons, and it was time for a change. YCS Miami meta consisted of less consistent and nerf versions of the decks I previously listed, as well as some strong new contenders in the likes of Mermails, Firefists, Hieratics, and Spellbooks. To fully understand the card pool of this format, I would recommend checking out the September 2012 ban list. I'll put a link to it in the description of this video. I'm going to focus on the changes from the list prior to showcase some of the big differences, so if you want the full list, please check the link in the description. Right off the bat, we have some newly unlimited cards. I'll be honest, not all are listed because anything besides these three had very little impact on the meta. The first change is Necrogarna to 3. Lightsworn is nowhere near where it used to be, and there are simply better cards to run, but this was a decent change. A massive change was Emergency Teleport to 3. This enables multiple decks to hard combo and is extremely splashable. Finally, we have Destiny Draw to 3, which almost makes you think Teledata is back, but Malicious is still at 2, so don't get too excited. Newly semi-limited cards had a big impact. Kalut to 2 is a decent buff to Blackwings. Not sure how potent the deck is still, but it definitely has potential. Debris Dragon to 2 is pretty crazy, and a nice buff to Synchro decks, which feel a bit squeezed out of the meta during this era. Next up is Rescue Rabbit. This is a clear nerf to Dino Rabbit, as well as the fact that this card is pretty splashable in a lot of different strategies. The Agent of Mystery Earth going up to 2 reopened the door on agents being playable. Tour Guide is another consistency nerf to Dino Rabbit, and any deck that wants to abuse Sangan or rank 3s like windups. A Hero Lives to 2 was a bit odd, but worth noting. Emergency Call and Hieratic Seal of Convocation are both meta-relevant consistency cards that dial both decks back a bit. Although that definitely hurts Hieratics more than Heroes due to the existence of reinforcements of the army. Pot of Duality to 2 was also a bit odd, but again, it really feels like Konami was trying to dial back the consistency of all the decks. Reasoning to 2 was an interesting change, and on the last list they also put Xian's Smoke Signal to 2, so I feel like this could also reopen the door to 6 Samurai. Lastly, Mirror Force to 2 means there are actually quite a few board wipes in the game, which forces players to be a bit cautious when trying to make a push. Newly limited cards are where Konami went a bit more aggressive on the stronger archetypes. Leading off with a few spicy changes, Tsukiyomi is making its reappearance back in the game since GOAT format. Chaos Sorcerer drops back down to 1, probably as a target to the formerly dominant Chaos Dragons. Spore went from banned to 1, which is nice because Konami definitely over-nerfed synchro strategies. Red MD to 1 is another targeted nerf on Chaos Dragons, and apparently Konami had enough of Inzectors because both Hornet and Dragonfly to 1 feels a bit aggressive to me, but it is what it is. Windup Carries and Mighty to 1 drastically changes how windups play. They no longer try to loop cards out of your hand. They now are an aggressive XYZ OTK strategy, which I definitely find more preferable to the latter. Ivgishki Gust Kraken went to 1 because of some weird hand loop strategy that existed or something. I don't honestly remember it. Lastly, Ultimate Offering to 1 also felt a bit spicy, but with the direction the game was taking and with Shockmaster being playable, I guess I could see it. And now the moment you've all been waiting for. What spice got banned? We finally see an end to the sackiness that is Future Fusion, and I'm guessing Bryanak got banned because of non-once per turn loops. But some honorable mentions I felt retro Yu-Gi-Oh players may be happy about is on the list prior, but they finally banned Trap Dust Shoot. I'm actually a fan of Trishula, but the card was a bit silly and also worth banning. I feel like overall these changes were pretty healthy for the game, but like I said, Trap Dushu and Trishula were on the list prior, but since most people don't play the wind-up loop format, I figured it was worth mentioning that these cards are now gone. So now I want to move on to some of the generic staple monster cards. During this time, we saw a bit less of the good cards decks and more of your standard archetypes, so generic monsters feel as if they're beginning to fade a bit. That being said, it's worth mentioning BLS is still in the game. Tour Guide from the Underworld is obviously still insane in this meta, Thunder King is still very potent in such an XYZ dominant meta, but with the addition of Mermails, it loses a bit of its thunder. As I said before, Rescue Rabbit is surprisingly splashable. It can be used in a lot of unique decks beyond just dinos, like X-Sabers, Fire Fist, and Machines. Fire Fist Bear is also pretty splashable. A 3-bear, a gorilla, tanky, and a Tensu package is pretty easy to splash into decks, especially those that run rank 4 strategies. The extra destruction and card advantage feels really nice. Jurak Gwaiba is surprisingly splashed in a lot of lists. I saw an agent deck play 3 Gwaiba just to try to gain access to Logia Dolka, but many decks will take this approach, if they have the room. Card D was very overhyped on release, but still found its way into a lot of the meta decks, especially those that need the extra consistency, like Insectors. We all fear the power of Shockmaster. This card goes crazy in rank 4 decks. Zenmaines is the generic splashable rank 3 you will see in just about everything. And I felt Quasar was worth mentioning because during this era of Yu-Gi-Oh!, if you summon Quasar, it's basically a win condition. So this is a massive threat when facing synchro decks. Real quick, just to cover hand traps, they're the same as they are in Tengu Plant format, although I will say, with OTKs being more relevant, especially around boards with minimal negates, the battle hand traps like Fader and Swift Scarecrow do feel a bit stronger. The generic spells don't change much from Tengu Plant format, outside of the fact that Duality is now at 2, Lance is really powerful, especially due to all the powerful battle monsters like Bear and Gwaiba. I removed Enemy Controller from this list because this format has far less floaters than the likes of Tengu Plant, so Enemy Controller becomes less valuable. Still a great card though. And of course, E-Telly to 3 was huge and opened up a ton of different decks like Grand Soil Psychics and Karakuri. The traps are actually very relevant in this format. While many you've also seen before, a big card in Miami format is Torrential Tribute. This card at 2 means it's a very relevant threat in just about every game that you need to be thinking about when summoning monsters. Due to a lack of floaters, Bottomless also goes up in value compared to the formats prior. Compulsory also saw a boost in relevancy as a 1 card out to sticky XYZ monsters like Maystroke and Zenmaines. Due to Mirror Force and Torrential being at 2, Starlight Road now is very relevant and even has potential in combo decks. Fiendish Chain is super powerful in this format as well. Since many decks splash Fire Fist engines and go into powerful XYZs, this can force a Logia negate and outs the other sticky XYZs that you tend to deal with. Threatening Roar is a card I see a few decks play typically that need to stall time to set up big advantage, like Insectors and Spellbooks. The last card is Deck Devastation Virus. Many of the meta decks rely on small monsters, so you'll see a lot of players force strategies around this, like maining Vorse Raider and Fire Fist as an example. XYZs are extremely dominant in this era of Yu-Gi-Oh! And make up about 90% of most extra decks in the meta. So if you're interested in learning the format, I would recommend reading the cards on the screen here, as they are commonly played across a lot of different decks. Compared to other formats, I can't say this format's diversity is on par with the likes of Tengu Plant format. The big contributor to that is the fact that most decks in this metagame have to keep up with the pacing and explosiveness of windups and Mermails. Surprisingly, there are a lot of decks that are able to do that, but this also means compared to other formats, there will be a decent amount of decks that can't quite make that cut. That being said, both of these decks do have clear-cut weaknesses. Windups are kind of an all-or-nothing deck. Once they combo, they need to win or they have very little gas in the tank. This means a well-timed Veiler or Maxi can cause them problems. That being said, hand traps feel a bit less mainable due to Mermails being virtually unaffected by them, so traps are more of the dominant interruption tool in this format. It is also worth noting that windups, while they can make really strong boards and OTK pretty quickly, they don't really produce any negation at all. So assuming you survive, it's actually pretty easy to break their boards once they've been established. As for Mermails, the fact that Abyss Dweller is a legal generic rank 4 means every deck has access to a solid counterplay tool, in addition to the fact that Soul Drain is at 3. But aside from these two titans, let's look at some of the other decks that are definitely capable of keeping up. Starting in order of what actually topped YCS Miami, in 4th place they had Teleport Car Curry, which was basically the most explosive version of Car Curry we have seen to date, running triple Instant Fusion and triple Emergency Teleport, as well as triple Desynchro. This deck combos off really hard and wins really fast. If your opponent isn't on main deck Maxi, which most people weren't at the time, this deck can go really hard. Car Curry is definitely enabled by a lot of these extra tools that are legal in this format compared to others. Up next, whether you love it or hate it, we have Dark World. This deck actually seemed pretty strong during this time just because of the ability to abuse the virus cards such as Deck Devastation Virus and Eradicator. This was really helpful against the likes of windups because Deck Devi against windups basically hits every monster in their deck, so it puts them in a really bad spot, and that's why this deck was able to see success at the time, being a hard counter to windups. Fire Fist is the new control player's dream. This engine is very flexible and does a fantastic job at gaining advantage through its small monster lineup. There are multiple ways to approach building this deck. It even saw some success with the small Dino Rabbit engine. Speaking of Dino Rabbit, this deck, while nerfed, still saw multiple tops in YCS Miami. Its potent control around back row and access to main deck macro really hurts a lot of other decks in the meta. Just like any deck though, Dino Rabbit has its weaknesses, Bubble Beat being one of them. This new approach to Hero Stun abuses Bubble Man to make Blade Armor Ninja or Heroic Champion Excalibur to dish out massive damage very quickly while simultaneously filling the graveyard for Miracle Fusion. Having newfound access to Elemental Hero Escuderio also means that Super Poly can hit just about every type in the game. Yet another nerf deck that made its reappearance in the top cut of YCS Miami, Inzektor saw more success post-ban list than it did pre-ban list. Pop 2/2 is still really strong. Hieratics is another interesting deck in this format. It saw tops in YCS Miami, and I'll be honest, this deck is very difficult to pilot and understand. But if you get a good grasp on it, this deck feels really strong, and it's a ton of fun to play. Moving on to decks that didn't top at the exact time, but have a lot of potential, Robert Boyagin's Electrum OTK topped in the format after Miami, and it's completely playable in this format as well. I reached out to him and asked how he would build it in this format, and this is his updated list. Another deck that topped in a YCS prior to this one is Jeff Jones' Grand Soil Psychics. This deck has a lot of potential in YCS Miami format as well, and I think it's really fun to play. Grand Soil really elevates what Psychics can do, and so I would definitely recommend giving this deck a try. I think it's definitely still a strong contender. Geargia Car Curry also saw some tops during this era, but I will say with Mermail Firefist being out, it does give it a bit tougher of a matchup, although going into Dweller and just having Fiendish Chains around can definitely help the matchups. I would still say this deck is pretty strong, and I'm always a fan of Geargia. No format is short of its degeneracy. Tyler Tabman did manage to top in the format prior with Final Countdown, the only difference being he had 3 duality instead of 2, so I swapped out one of those dualities just for a main deck Lava Golem, but even though this deck isn't necessarily the most fun to play against, it is still technically viable because 1 day a piece is at 3 in this format, so it's definitely something to look out for. Although I will say, if you're aware of it, it becomes a lot easier to play against once you kind of know how it functions, so it's not as big of a concern, but it still is a little bit annoying. Agents make a bit of a resurface with Earth going back to 2. It's definitely not as strong as it was in Tengu Plant format, but it does still put out some numbers and did see some tops around this time, so it's definitely worth mentioning. Spellbooks is a deck that I'm honestly fascinated didn't see more success. It's relatively full power here outside of having Judgment, but one thing I will say is people didn't really build the deck all that well. As you can see on the list here, this was a list that topped historically, but I certainly wouldn't build Spellbooks this way in modern iterations of Miami Spellbooks, so I think this deck is a lot stronger than its results were showing. Regardless, it would be a bit ambitious to say that this deck doesn't have potential. While nerfed pretty hard with the loss of Future Fusion, Chaos Dragons actually still saw a bit of success during this time, and it's definitely not something to overlook. Light Pulsar Dragon plus Red MD is still really good. The Fire King structure deck was released a week prior to YCS Miami, and I don't think players had enough time to test this deck out before moving on to the next format. So I think this is another deck that could be really sleeper and has a lot of potential. I just don't know what it is because honestly I've never played the deck before. Junkdoppel is the deck I actually topped with historically in this format. Its ability to block OTKs with Fader and easily make Black Rose makes this deck super pesky for the likes of windups. I have no idea if this is the build I used back then, I just know Quasar is a win con and a ton of fun to play around. I know I already covered Mermails, but this is the last deck on my list I wanted to talk about. Undyne Mermail was a different variation of the deck. It focused more around using the Atlantean cards and less around using the Mermail cards. You can see we're not using Abystius in this build, and this deck actually was topping during the time as well. Mermails had a lot of different ways to be built during this format, so I thought it was worth mentioning that you can kind of build this however you want and see how it feels. As I said before, this is my second favorite format only to Tengu Plant, and it has a lot of positive qualities. The archetypes are very iconic and nostalgic, the gameplay is still skillful and back and forth, you get to play a lot of these decks prior to the insane power creep Tachyon Galaxy release to the game. The gameplay feels a bit more die roll dependent compared to prior formats, but it's still relatively balanced enough to not make or break your tournament runs. So with all that being said, if you're wondering how to give this format a try, I have a few steps. First, join my Discord. I'm attempting to start a community for this format there, and the more people interested we get, the sooner I can start running tournaments. I'll put a link to it in the description below. This can also help you find other people who want to test it, and if you want to view and download the decks I showcased today, they're all available on my website, tcgrewind.com. You can find the ban list there as well. Lastly, subscribe to my channel. While I don't intend on putting a big focus on this format for content, I will still release a video here and there. My focus is always going to be Tengu Plant format because it is my favorite format, but I definitely want to expand and breach out into other formats, this being the second one that I want to focus on, so I will be releasing content for it occasionally as I have time. This is unexplored territory for a lot of us, so keep an open mind and feel free to ask questions. The entire purpose of this video is just to let people know this format exists, because prior to making this, aside from a select few of my subscribers and community members, very few people have even heard of it. So that's going to wrap it up for this video, you guys. I really hope that you guys enjoy it and are willing to give this format a try. I, more than anyone, know how difficult it is to start promoting a format that most people don't like to play or haven't heard of. So for those of you keeping an open mind and are willing to try it, I genuinely appreciate you, and I would look forward to playing games with all of you. That being said, we'll give a quick shout out to my Patreons. So shout out to Grant Johnson, Beast Eyes, Slap God, My Dude, Photo Shooty, Brian Ford, and Sven Olbrand. Thank you guys so much for the support. This channel literally wouldn't be possible without you. But other than that, thank you guys so much for watching. Let me know in the comments what you think of YCS Miami format and what decks you're excited to play. And make sure you guys have a great time dueling today.